At exactly 11:30 a.m. on December 22, 1944, 4 German officers emerged from the winter trees outside Bastogne, Belgium, walking carefully toward the American lines with a white flag lifted above the swirling snow. They carried a message, formal, precise, and laced with threat. General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps demanded the surrender of the American forces inside the town. According to him, the situation was hopeless. The Americans were surrounded by 7 German divisions. They had little ammunition, fewer supplies, and no chance of relief. The only honorable path, the Germans said, was unconditional surrender. If the Americans refused, the letter warned, they would face total annihilation by German artillery and armored forces already tightening around the town. Inside a dim, crowded command post, Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, was asleep when his staff shook him awake. They handed him the typed ultimatum. McAuliffe frowned, rubbed his eyes, and read the message. He looked up at the officers gathered around him and uttered the single word that would enter world history: nuts. His staff thought it was a joke, a gut reaction before the real answer. But McAuliffe insisted that would be his official reply. No speeches. No explanations. Just nuts. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard typed the response. Colonel Joseph Harper delivered it to the German officers in person. When the confused Germans asked what the word meant, Harper explained with cold clarity, "It means the same as go to hell." In other words, no surrender. No negotiation. No hesitation. What sounded like a one-word quip was actually the distilled essence of something the American Army had spent more than 2 decades creating, a doctrine that made American forces fight differently than any other army in the Second World War. When surrounded, other armies defended and waited for rescue. Americans counterattacked. This didn't happen by chance or personality. It came from decisions made long before the first shots of the war were fired. The very roots of McAuliffe's reply stretched back to the 1920s, to the reforms of a quiet, disciplined officer named George Catlett Marshall. The story began on September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. That same day, Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. President Franklin Roosevelt had bypassed 33 generals senior to him, shocking the establishment. Marshall inherited an army that ranked 17th in the world, 174,000 soldiers scattered across the globe, poorly equipped, undertrained, and unprepared for anything resembling a modern war. They drilled for parades more than combat. They studied paperwork more than tactics. They resembled a constabulary force, not a mechanized army ready for global conflict. But Marshall had seen modern war up close. He had served in France during the First World War and watched American troops die by the thousands in frontal assaults planned by rigid command structures that could not adapt to confusion, surprise, or speed. He helped plan the Ardennes Offensive, the largest and bloodiest American battle in history, and he never forgot the chaos. He saw officers paralyzed when communications failed. He saw units frozen because they had been trained to wait for orders instead of acting on initiative. And he swore that if America ever fought again, its army would fight differently. Years before becoming Chief of Staff, Marshall had already begun reshaping the future of American warfare. From 1927 to 1932, he served as Assistant Commandant of the Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia. In those 4.5 years, he transformed the school into a factory for producing modern combat leaders. Nearly 200 officers who studied or taught under him would become generals. Names like Omar Bradley, Joseph Stilwell, Matthew Ridgway, and Walter Bedell Smith. Marshall stripped away the old method of slow academic war games and replaced them with fast, brutally realistic decision-making exercises. Officers would be marched into the field with no advance warning. An instructor would point to the terrain. Your unit is here. The enemy is in that direction. What are your orders? They had 5 minutes. No written plans. No perfect information. No time to be cautious. Think fast. Decide fast. Act fast. The result was the birth of an entirely new tactical philosophy. When attacked, counterattack immediately. Exploit enemy weakness before they recover. Keep the enemy off balance. Momentum is a weapon. Speed is protection. Hesitation is fatal. Marshall's reforms spread throughout the army as his students became teachers. So when he became Chief of Staff in 1939, he expanded these principles across the entire force. He launched the largest training overhaul in American military history. Officers who hesitated, clung to old methods, or failed to show initiative were ruthlessly removed. More than 600 officers were relieved or forced into retirement before America entered the war. Marshall wasn't destroying the officer corps, he was saving it from irrelevance. The Army expanded from 174,000 to millions. But numbers alone weren't enough. Training had to support doctrine. In 1940 and 1941, the Louisiana Maneuvers put nearly 500,000 American soldiers into the largest peacetime military exercise the country had ever seen. Entire divisions maneuvered across thousands of square miles in a test of Marshall's ideas. The results were unmistakable. Units that counterattacked immediately thrived. Units that waited for orders failed. Junior officers who acted on initiative succeeded. Those who hesitated caused their units to crumble. Even officers like Eisenhower and Patton distinguished themselves with daring maneuvers that revealed the future shape of American warfare. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the new doctrine was already embedded in its manuals and its culture. Field Manual 100-5 declared that offensive action was the decisive form of combat. Defense was only temporary. When attacked, the manual said, counterattack immediately. Don't wait. Don't plan for perfection. Hit back now, before the enemy can consolidate. This approach made American tactical behavior almost shockingly different from British, French, or Soviet doctrine. Other Allied armies fought deliberately, slowly, methodically. Americans fought fast. While others waited for orders, Americans acted on commanders' intent. While others prepared for hours, Americans exploited opportunities in minutes. It seemed reckless to outsiders. But on the battlefield, speed often meant survival. The first great test of this doctrine came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. American forces were badly beaten by German troops under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Units collapsed. Lines broke. Thousands were killed or captured. By all logic, the Americans should have withdrawn, reorganized, and spent weeks preparing a deliberate counterattack, as the British would have. Instead, within 24 hours, American artillery was re-established, infantry regiments were reforming, tank crews were refueling, and counterattacks were already underway. Within days, the Germans had been halted. Within a week, the lost ground had been retaken. American commanders weren't waiting to recover. They were attacking. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, this doctrine was deeply ingrained. Soldiers were trained to counterattack even when exhausted, surprised, or outnumbered. Officers expected to act without waiting. Americans won ground not through flawless planning but through relentless pressure and decentralized initiative. Which brings us back to December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The German surprise offensive smashed into thin American lines across Belgium and Luxembourg, creating an 85-mile-wide bulge in the Allied front. Tens of thousands of Americans were killed, captured, or scattered. The German drive threatened to reach the Meuse River and potentially split the Allied armies. But as German armored columns pushed forward, something happened that German commanders had not anticipated. Everywhere, isolated American units counterattacked, small groups, platoons, companies who refused to retreat. A handful of men would attack a crossroad, delay a column, disrupt a timetable. Dozens of small counterattacks accumulated into hours of delay that the Germans could not afford. Meanwhile, at 11 a.m. on December 19th, Eisenhower met his commanders at Verdun. He didn't see disaster. He saw opportunity. The Germans were out of their fortifications and exposed. This was the moment to strike. He asked Patton how soon Third Army could attack north into the German flank. Patton stunned the room by saying he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Most strategists believed such an army-scale maneuver would take weeks. But Patton had already prepared contingency plans. Within 66 hours, Third Army was attacking north. And at the center of the storm was Bastogne. Bastogne, with its 7 converging roads, was the key to the German advance. Control the town, and you control the entire region. The 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and support units, about 15,000 men total, were surrounded by more than 45,000 Germans. Conventional logic said to dig in and wait for rescue. American doctrine said otherwise. Throughout the siege, American forces attacked. When German patrols probed the line, American soldiers smashed into them with counterattacks. When German artillery positions were discovered, Americans raided them at night. When German infantry infiltrated the woods, American patrols hunted them down. The entire defensive perimeter, north, south, east, and west, was alive with aggressive, small-unit action. German commanders trying to mass forces for a breakthrough found themselves constantly harassed, disrupted, and thrown off balance. Artillery units like the all-black 969th Field Artillery Battalion fired more than 10,000 rounds, often so close to American lines that shell fragments wounded their own troops. But this was the doctrine: better to risk friendly fire than let the enemy gain momentum. Every soldier, from private to colonel, knew instinctively that defense alone could not save Bastogne. Only continuous offensive action could keep the Germans from concentrating their power. So when the German officers arrived with their ultimatum on December 22nd, McAuliffe's response, "Nuts," was more than bravado. It captured the mindset of an army trained for decades to think offensively, to reject paralysis, and to act decisively even when surrounded. Relief finally came on December 26th when the lead tank of Cobra King from the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and rolled into Bastogne. The defenders cheered, but they did not rest. Within 24 hours, they were attacking outward, expanding the corridor, pushing the Germans back. German officers could not fathom how a battered, frozen, exhausted division could immediately resume offensive operations. But this was American doctrine in action: offense by default, defense only until it's time to attack again. By January 25, 1945, the Bulge had been erased. The Germans had lost tens of thousands of irreplaceable men and machines. The American army had suffered brutally as well, but it had done something extraordinary. It had absorbed a massive surprise attack and turned it into a decisive victory through speed, initiative, and relentless offensive spirit. After the war, analysts studied the battles and confirmed what Marshall had believed from the beginning: aggressive, continuous offensive action, executed by decentralized decision-makers empowered to act, was often more effective and produced fewer cumulative casualties than slow, cautious, methodical approaches. These ideas shaped American doctrine for generations, from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf War and beyond. And so, the story of Bastogne is not just the story of a siege or a witty reply. It is the story of an army that spent 20 years reinventing itself, training to think faster, act faster, and strike sooner than its enemies expected. It is the story of soldiers who learned from the moment they enlisted that the best way to survive an attack was to attack right back. And it is the story of leaders, from Marshall to Eisenhower to Patton, who believed in the power of initiative, speed, and momentum. When General McAuliffe said, "nuts," he was not speaking only for himself. He was speaking for an entire doctrine, an entire culture, an entire army that had been built to think exactly that way. His reply captured what American soldiers had been trained to embody: relentless defiance, unbroken initiative, and an unshakable commitment to the offensive even when surrounded. And in the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, that doctrine changed the course of the war. If you found this story compelling, consider liking the video. It helps us bring more of these powerful moments from history to life. Subscribe for more World War II stories told in rich detail. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans the world, united by a passion for the past and the lessons it continues to teach.